Mr. Chairman, my amendment is simple. It would cut spending in the bill across the board by 0.5%. While this appropriations bill funds critical national priorities such as research at the National Institutes of Health, pandemic flu preparedness, and job training programs, the underlying bill provides $730.5 billion, making it the largest of 12 appropriations bills. The total is $59.4 billion. That is 9% more than the regular FY 2009 appropriations and $1.9 billion more than the requested by the President. It also includes $163.4 billion in discretionary spending, which is $11.15 billion, or 7% over last year's level. I do not question the value of many of the programs funded by this bill. This bill funds programs that are critical to my district, like Impact Aid, community health centers, the TRIO program, nurse training and career technical education. But I offer this amendment because our nation cannot continue on this path of deficit spending without serious negative long-term consequences. Among the various appropriations bills, this bill is typically the largest single source of discretionary funds for domestic federal programs. It represents a 12.8% increase in spending over the level we were operating under in fiscal year 2008, less than 1 year ago. And while I travel around my district and talk to constituents, their greatest concern is spending. It's hard to explain to a family that has had to make tough choices about their own spending that Washington can't make the same tough choices. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will yield a minute to the
gentleman from Kansas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia. Mr. Chairman, this is really a pretty straightforward amendment, but I want to put it in perspective. This bill is a 7% increase over last year's funding. The gentleman from Virginia is merely asking for a 0.5% reduction in something that's already increased by 7%. When you include what was allocated in the stimulus bill for these very same agencies, it's a 93% increase. So when you look at it in total, we're merely scratching the surface by having some common sense brought into the amount of money being spent. Now, this doesn't eliminate any programs. This doesn't put anybody in a hardship. This simply says that rather than have a 93% in total increase for this funding, that we're going to reduce it by a total of $11.15 billion. Now, this is $11.15 billion that we will not have to borrow, that our children will not have to pay back. This is money that we will not be obligated to return to the people in China. So this is a common sense amendment, and I urge its adoption.
Gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the gentleman from Kansas. Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the past couple of months, we've been passing spending bills with double-digit increases year over year, and these are unacceptable increases in spending. Already, there have been mentions of tax increases that will be necessary to maintain this level of spending. Imagine that for a moment, tax increases in the name of fiscal responsibility. The administration projects that the budget deficit will reach $1.8 trillion in 2009 compared to $455 billion in 2008. This represents a 3.2% of our gross domestic product, up from $161 billion or 1.2% of GDP in FY 2007. As a share of GDP, this will be the largest deficit since World War II. For FY 2009, we have a $2 trillion deficit. Between FY 2010 and FY 2019, the Congressional Budget Office estimates cumulative deficits could reach as high as $10 trillion. A few other signs that we have in dangerous territory when it comes to the nation's economic security are: this Congress raised the statutory debt limit from $11.315 trillion to $12.104 trillion in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act earlier this year, and together China and Japan hold almost 41% of our foreign-held debt, which is 27.8% of the gross federal debt. The question then becomes, how and when do we slow the growth? When do we make the tough decisions on spending? This amendment is an opportunity to show that this Congress wants to make responsible decisions on spending and to achieve fiscal discipline. Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
Wisconsin is reserving his right to close. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I recognize Mr. Brown for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to see that finally, after 10 appropriations bills under closed rules, the Democratic majority has finally seen fit to allow this sensible cost reduction amendment. The underlying bill increases the funding for the Departments of Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education by 25%. Mr. Speaker, isn't a 24.5% increase over last year enough? Is the Department of Labor really going to feel the effects of this modest amendment? We're only talking about reducing their increase by half a penny for every dollar that the agency spends. The American people are feeling the squeeze of this economy, and to date, Congress has done nothing to ease their burdens or address their frustrations. This modest reduction, Mr. Speaker, however small, is an important step. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment. Now I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, this amendment
Gentleman from Virginia has 20 seconds remaining.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, this is a good amendment, and it puts us back on the path of fiscal discipline, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.